The autumn evening of 1924 settled over the Hawthorne Ranch like a wool blanket drawn across weary shoulders.
Thomas, this
The
land
Rocky
holds our
Mountains
story.
stood in the
Honor it.
distance,
I
their
will,
peaks
Grandfather.
already dusted with
Promise.
the first snow of
Good.
the
Now
season,
go on.
catching the last amber light of a sun that seemed reluctant to leave. On the wide porch of the two-story farmhouse, two figures sat in wooden chairs worn smooth by three generations of use. One was young, barely 18, with the restless energy of someone standing at the threshold of manhood. The other was ancient, 93 years old, his hair white as the mountain snow, his face mapped with lines that told of winters survived and battles won. Thomas Hawthorne watched his grandfather stare at those distant peaks, wondering what memories lived behind those still sharp eyes. Tomorrow, Thomas would board a train heading east. He had enlisted in the army, following a path that young men of his generation were expected to walk. This was his last night at home, and something about the weight of that knowledge made him bold. Grandfather Thomas said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I want to ask you something before I leave." Silas Hawthorne turned his gaze from the mountains to his grandson. His eyes, dark as coffee and twice as strong, held a depth that Thomas had always found both comforting and slightly unsettling. The old man had seen things done, things survived, things that belonged to a wilder age. "Ask," Silas said simply. Thomas hesitated, then pushed forward. "How do you know when to trust someone? I mean, really trust them? When do you know it is worth risking everything for another person?" The question hung in the air between them. A hawk circled lazily overhead, riding the thermal currents rising from the valley floor. Somewhere in the barn, a horse whinnied softly. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached for his pipe, packed it slowly with tobacco, and struck a match. The flame illuminated his weathered face, casting dancing shadows across features that had once been called handsome and were now simply called memorable. "Did I ever tell you," Silas began, the smoke curling around his words, "how I met your great-grandmother? The real story, not the one your father tells at Sunday dinners." Thomas leaned forward. "I know she was tall and strong, and that she used to be a nun." "A nun they threw away," Silas corrected gently. "A woman they tried to break and could not. A woman who walked through hell and came out the other side still standing." He drew on his pipe, and his eyes grew distant, looking at something far beyond the mountains, far beyond the present moment. "It was the winter of 1874, he said. "I was 43 years old, and I had been living alone on that mountain for 8 years. I thought I would die there alone, and I thought that was exactly what I deserved. But then on the worst night of the worst blizzard I had ever seen, someone knocked on my gate." Thomas settled back in his chair, pulled his jacket tighter against the evening chill, and listened as his grandfather's voice carried him back 50 years to a night when everything changed. The snow that winter came down like the wrath of God himself. Silas Hawthorne stood at the window of his cabin, watching the white curtain of ice and wind tear across the mountain. He had seen bad winters before. 20 years of trapping and hunting in these mountains had taught him to respect the weather the way a man respects a loaded gun pointed at his chest. But this storm was different. This storm felt personal. The cabin groaned under the assault, its log walls solid but not invincible. Silas had built this place with his own hands 8 years ago, choosing the location for its isolation as much as its shelter. He had wanted to disappear from the world of men, and he had succeeded perhaps too well. At 43, he was still strong, still capable, still deadly with the Sharps rifle that hung above his fireplace. His beard was streaked with gray now, and his joints ached in the cold more than they used to, but he could still track a deer through fresh snow, still skin a beaver in under 5 minutes, still survive where lesser men would perish. These skills meant nothing against the loneliness. But loneliness was what he had chosen, and loneliness was what he deserved. He was about to turn away from the window, to add another log to the fire, and settle in for another long night of silence when he heard it. A sound at the gate, not the wind, not a falling branch, something else, something deliberate. Silas grabbed his rifle and moved to the door with the silent efficiency of a man who had spent decades hunting things that could kill him. He lifted the heavy wooden bar, cracked the door just wide enough to peer through, and raised his lantern against the darkness. The light fell upon a figure standing at his gate, and Silas felt his breath catch in his throat. It was a woman. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, her shoulders broad beneath a torn black coat that might once have been a nun's habit. Her hair was black as a raven's wing, matted and wild from the wind. Her feet were bare in the snow, and her skin was marked with wounds, Bruises dark as thunderclouds, cuts that still seeped crimson welts that spoke of violence recent and deliberate. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They were black as his own, deep as mountain wells, and in them burned something that Silas recognized with a shock of kinship. Pride, pain, and the desperate defiance of a creature that had been cornered but refused to submit. She did not flinch from his rifle. She did not cower or weep or beg. She simply stood there in the howling storm, snow accumulating on her shoulders, and spoke in a voice low and rough from cold or screaming or both. I need shelter for one night. I will do anything you ask in return. Silas looked at her for a long moment, not at her body, not at her wounds, not at the strange sight of a giant woman in nun's clothing standing in a blizzard. He looked at her eyes. He knew that look. He had seen it in the mirror for 8 years. The look of someone who had lost everything. Someone with no more choices. Someone at the end of their rope, hoping the rope would hold just a little longer. He lowered his rifle and pulled the gate open. Another hour out here, and you would be dead, he said. Come inside. The woman called herself Catherine Shaw, and she said nothing more that first night. Silas led her into the cabin, shut the door against the screaming wind, and gestured toward the fireplace where flames crackled and danced. The small space built for one man's solitude suddenly felt different, with another presence inside it. Fuller, stranger, charged with something he could not name. Catherine moved to the fire with the careful steps of someone who had walked too far and fought too hard. She lowered herself to the wooden floor near the hearth, her large hands reaching toward the heat with something like reverence. The firelight played across her features, illuminating the damage that had been done to her. Silas saw it all now. The marks on her wrists where ropes had bitten deep, the long cuts across her shoulders, some fresh and some scarred over, the bruises that mottled her arms and neck in shades of purple and yellow and sick green. These were not the marks of an accident or an animal attack. These were the marks of human cruelty, systematic and prolonged. He said nothing. He ladled out a bowl of hot soup from the pot hanging over the fire and handed it to her. She looked at the bowl, then up at him and asked a question that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Are you not afraid of me? No, he answered simply. Most white men are. Most white women, too. They look at me like I am something unnatural. Silas leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching her with eyes that gave nothing away. I see a woman about to freeze to death. That is all. Catherine held his gaze for a long moment, searching for something. Lies, perhaps, or hidden intentions. Finding neither, she lowered her eyes to the soup and began to eat. Each spoonful seemed to require enormous effort, as if she had been running on nothing but will for days. Silas added logs to the fire. The crackling sound filled the silence like an old friend's conversation. When she had finished, Catherine set the bowl aside and pulled the blanket he had given her over her battered legs. A long time passed before she spoke again, and when she did, she still did not look at him. I will leave in the morning. I do not want to cause you trouble. Silas glanced at the frost-covered window. Outside was nothing but white death and howling darkness. Where will you go? Catherine said nothing. The snow is knee-deep and getting deeper. Going out there now is suicide. She looked up at him then, and he saw the suspicion in her eyes soften slightly, though her guard remained firmly in place. If I stay, what do you want me to do? The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Silas knew what she was really asking. He had lived long enough and seen enough of the world to understand what a woman in her position might expect from a man offering shelter. Nothing, he said, his voice calm but firm. Just stay until the storm passes. Catherine stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for hidden motives, for the crack in the mask that would reveal the predator beneath. But Silas did not look away. He did not elaborate or justify or explain. He simply handed her another blanket and turned toward his own bed in the corner. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the pop of burning wood and the muffled roar of the storm outside. Finally, Catherine lay down near the fire. Her breathing slowly evened out, though Silas noticed that one hand remained tucked beneath her pillow, her fingers curled around something she had hidden there. He saw the glint of metal in the firelight. A knife. She was protecting herself even in sleep. Even in the home of a stranger who had shown her nothing but kindness. She could not afford to trust, and Silas understood that better than she could possibly know. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the darkness, whittling a piece of pine, occasionally glancing at the giant woman curled up like a wounded child near his fire. Outside, the white storm screamed and raged. Inside, a strange kind of peace settled over the cabin. Two broken people sharing shelter from the cold. Neither knew yet what that night would lead to. Neither knew that by morning the snow would be deeper, the world more dangerous, and their lives would be tangled together in ways neither could have predicted. Morning came gray and brutal. Silas woke before dawn as he always did and opened the cabin door to assess the damage. The snow had piled up nearly to the top of the frame, and the wind still howled across the mountain with the voice of something hungry and patient. No one, not even someone as strong as the woman sleeping by his fire, could travel in conditions like these. He closed the door and began preparing breakfast. Bacon and eggs, simple fare, but hot and filling. The smell of cooking food filled the small cabin, and soon Catherine stirred from her place near the hearth. She stretched, and Silas watched from the corner of his eye as the muscles in her shoulders and arms moved beneath the thin fabric of her torn clothing. She was built like no woman he had ever seen, solid and powerful with the frame of a man who worked the mines or felled timber for a living. Catherine looked toward the door, then at Silas, and spoke in a voice still rough from sleep. "I suppose I am not leaving yet." Silas handed her a plate of food and a cup of hot coffee. "You guessed right." They ate in silence, and when Catherine finished, she stood and walked toward the back door of the cabin. Silas followed, curious despite himself. Outside, the world was a white wasteland, but instead of retreating from the cold, Catherine bent down and lifted something from the snow. Silas felt his jaw drop slightly. It was a fallen tree trunk, the remains of a pine that had snapped under the weight of ice and wind. The thing must have weighed 200 pounds at least. Catherine lifted it as if it were nothing more than a bundle of kindling, carried it to the woodpile near the house, and set it down without apparent effort. She turned back and caught him staring. "Have you always been that strong?" he asked. Catherine shrugged, a gesture that somehow conveyed both pride and pain. "To survive in my convent," she said, "you had to be strong. They believed that hard labor would purify what they called the abnormality in me." Abnormality? Catherine met his gaze with a look of challenge, as if daring him to flinch. "I am taller than most men. Stronger too. Since I was 10 years old, I could wrestle grown men to the ground. My parents thought there was something wrong with me. They said I was touched by the devil." Silas said nothing. He had learned long ago that the best response to a confession was silence, giving the speaker room to continue or to stop as they chose. Catherine turned back to the snow and resumed working, clearing a path with the speed and efficiency of two men. Silas joined her, and together they labored through the morning, repairing storm damage, clearing snow, checking on the horses in the small stable behind the cabin. They did not speak much, but the silence between them was different now, less wary, almost comfortable. That evening, as they shared a simple meal by the fire, Catherine sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, her dark eyes fixed on the flames. Then, without warning, she spoke. "I have not been with anyone in months." "What about you, Silas?" Froze with his spoon halfway to his mouth. He set the bowl down, slowly leaned back in his chair, and looked at her steadily. "I do not expect that from you. You are not here to pay for kindness." Catherine watched him from the edge of the firelight. In the warm glow, her strong face softened for just a moment. "The man I met before you," she said quietly, "he did not think that way. I am not him." Catherine said nothing more, but her hand, which had been gripping the blanket tightly, finally relaxed, as if she had just set down a weight she had been carrying for a very long time. That night, Silas lay in his bed while Catherine slept on the floor near the fireplace. But something had shifted between them. There was no more suspicion, no more careful watching, only two people sheltering each other from a winter that wanted them dead. Before sleep took her, Catherine spoke softly, her back turned to him. "Tomorrow I will help with whatever needs doing. I am not used to taking without giving something back." "Here," Silas replied from the darkness, "you do not owe me anything." Outside, the snow continued to fall, but for the first time in 8 years, Silas Hawthorne's wooden cabin did not feel empty. It felt like the beginning of something shared. In the days that followed, the blizzard showed no mercy. Wind howled across the roof like wolves in winter. Snow piled higher and higher until the windows looked out on nothing but white walls. Silas and Catherine fell into a rhythm of survival, working together with the easy coordination of people who understood hard labor and asked nothing more than competence from each other. Silas taught her things: how to set traps for rabbits in the snow, how to read the weather from the color of the clouds, how to preserve meat so it would last through the worst of winter. Catherine absorbed everything with quick intelligence, her large hands surprisingly deft when given a task that required precision. In turn, she showed him what her body could do. She carried loads that would have broken his back. She chopped wood with a speed that seemed almost supernatural. When a section of the stable roof threatened to collapse under the weight of snow, she braced it with her shoulders, while Silas reinforced the beams, holding hundreds of pounds of wood and ice as casually as another woman might hold a basket of laundry. On the fourth evening, as the fire burned its brightest, Silas noticed something strange. Catherine was sitting too still. Her eyes were not watching the flames, but staring into the dark corner of the room where shadows stretched long and deep. He added another log to the fire and asked gently, "Those wounds on your shoulders, they were not from the mountain path, were they?" Catherine did not answer immediately. Her face remained turned toward the shadows, her dark eyes focused on a place that existed only in memory. Finally she spoke. "Not the mountain. People did this." Silas sat down beside her, keeping enough distance that she would not feel cornered. Catherine still did not look at him. She pulled the blanket from her shoulders, revealing the full extent of the damage. Long scars crisscrossed her back, some white with age, and some still purple with healing. The marks of a whip applied again and again over months or years. "My own sisters in faith." Silas felt his hands clench into fists, though his voice remained calm. "Tell me," and Catherine did. The story came out slowly, painfully, like a splinter being drawn from infected flesh. St. Agnes Convent sat in the high desert of New Mexico Territory, a place of red rock and burning sun and isolation so complete that a woman might scream for help and have no one hear her for 100 miles. It was not a place of prayer and contemplation. It was a place where families sent daughters they did not want to acknowledge. Girls who were too tall, too strong, too smart, too defiant, too different. Catherine had been 15 when her parents loaded her onto a wagon and drove her 300 miles to leave her at those gates. She had been tall even then, already towering over her mother and approaching her father's height. Strong enough to do the work of a grown man, strange enough that the neighbors whispered and the preacher looked at her with suspicious eyes. "They told me I was touched by the devil," Catherine said, her voice flat and distant. "They said only the sisters could cure me." For 14 years she had lived within those walls. 14 years of back-breaking labor, hauling water from deep wells, breaking rocks to build new buildings, digging graves for the sisters who did and the girls who did not survive their cures. The labor was meant to purify her, they said, to beat the devil out of her body through exhaustion and pain. But Catherine only grew stronger. Her muscles hardened, her endurance increased, and her spirit, though battered, refused to break. Then 6 months ago, everything changed. A wealthy benefactor began visiting the convent. Reverend Josiah Whitmore, a man of 58 years, rich from mining investments in Denver, respected in society, feared by those who knew him well. He came bearing gifts and donations, and the Mother Superior welcomed him with open arms and greedy eyes. "He saw me working in the courtyard," Catherine said. "I was carrying stones for the new chapel, stones that took 2 other women to lift together. He watched me for a long time, and then he spoke to the Mother Superior." What did he want? Catherine's jaw tightened. "Me. Not as a wife, as a servant, a special servant for his household in Denver. He offered to pay for my release from the convent. He said he would take responsibility for my spiritual development." Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "They did not ask for your consent. They told me I should be grateful. Grateful that anyone would want a freak like me. Grateful for the chance to serve a man of God outside these walls. But you refused." Catherine finally turned to look at him, and in her eyes he saw 14 years of rage compressed into a single burning point.
Honor it.
I told them I would rather die than belong to any man. I told them I was not property to be bought and sold. I told them that if Whitmore touched me, I would break every bone in his body. The fire crackled between them. Silas waited. "They beat me," Catherine continued. 10 lashes a day for 2 weeks. They locked me in the cellar without food or water. They told me I was a traitor to Gual and to the sisterhood. They said I did not deserve to live among decent people. And then, the night before Whitmore was supposed to collect me, I broke the cellar door. I went to the Mother Superior's office and took back the money that my parents had sent with me when I was 15, my inheritance from my grandmother. $300 that they had kept as payment for my care. Silas nodded slowly. It was your money. They called it theft. And when Whitmore tried to stop me at the gate, when he grabbed my arm and tried to drag me back, I pushed him away. She looked down at her hands. With my strength, that push broke his arm and cracked 3 of his ribs. They called it assault. They put a bounty on my head. $200 for my capture, dead or alive. Silas was quiet for a long moment. The fire cast dancing shadows across his face, hiding whatever he might have been feeling. Finally, he spoke. The money you took was yours by right. You did not steal anything. And Whitmore, he tried to force you. What you did was self-defense. Catherine looked at him with something like wonder. You believe me? Do you have any reason to lie to me? No, then I believe you. Something changed in Catherine's face then. The hard mask she had worn since arriving at his door cracked just slightly, and beneath it, Silas glimpsed the woman she might have been if life had been kinder. Someone capable of trust. Someone capable of hope. Thank you, she whispered. Silas reached out and placed his hand over hers. It was the first time he had touched her deliberately, and he felt her flinch before she forced herself to relax. You are safe here, he said. Whatever comes next, you are safe here. The storm outside howled on, but inside the cabin, something new had begun to grow. Something fragile and precious, like the first green shoot pushing through spring snow. And Silas Hawthorne, who had spent 8 years believing he deserved nothing but solitude and pain, began to wonder if perhaps he had been wrong. The next morning, Silas woke early and went outside to check the perimeter of his property. It was a habit from his years as a trapper, when letting your guard down could mean waking up to find a mountain lion in your camp, or a rival hunter going through your supplies. The storm had finally begun to ease, the wind dying down to occasional gusts, the snow falling more gently now. He walked the familiar paths, checking his traps, examining the tree line for any sign of movement. And that was when he saw them. Hoof prints in the snow, fresh ones made within the last few hours. Not the tracks of wild horses. These prints showed the clear marks of iron horseshoes. Someone had ridden to within half a mile of his cabin and stopped there, looking down at the thin curl of smoke rising from his chimney. Then they had turned and ridden away. Silas knelt in the snow, studying the tracks with the practiced eye of a man who had spent decades reading the stories that the wilderness wrote in dirt and mud and ice. At least 3 horses, moving carefully, deliberately. Not lost travelers seeking shelter. Hunters, searching for something or someone. He followed the tracks for 100 yards and stopped. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, he could see a thin wisp of smoke rising from somewhere in the forest. Someone had made camp close enough to watch his cabin. Silas turned and walked back home. He did not run. Running attracted attention. But his hand rested on the grip of his pistol the entire way, and his eyes never stopped moving. When he entered the cabin, Catherine was awake and dressed, preparing to start the morning's work. She looked at his face and immediately tensed. What is wrong? Silas closed the door and locked it behind him. Someone is watching us. At least 3 men camped about half a mile east. They have been observing this cabin. Catherine's face went pale beneath her weathered skin. They found me. I have to leave. Leave to where the snow is still too deep for travel on foot. And they are mounted. They would catch you before you made it 5 miles. Then what do I do? Silas walked to the fireplace and took down his Sharps rifle. He checked the action, loaded it with practiced efficiency, and set it beside the door. You stay, and we prepare. Prepare for what? For whatever comes next. He looked at her, and something in his eyes made Catherine fall silent. 8 years ago, I came to this mountain to die. I had lost everything that mattered to me, and I thought I deserved nothing but solitude and suffering. But now, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Now there is something worth protecting, and I will be damned if I let anyone take it away. Catherine stared at him. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. No one had ever looked at her as something worth protecting rather than something to be used or feared. Why, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would you risk yourself for me? You do not know me. You owe me nothing. Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with memories he had never shared with anyone. 8 years ago, I was not there when the people I loved needed me most. I was not there to protect them, to comfort them, to hold their hands when they passed from this world. I have lived with that failure every day since. He met her eyes. I am not going to make that mistake again. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the wind whispered secrets through the pine trees. And Catherine Shaw, who had spent 14 years being told she was worthless, who had been beaten and imprisoned and hunted like an animal, felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Hope. She did not trust it. She had learned too well what happened when you let yourself hope. But she could not quite extinguish it either. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now," Silas said, "we wait. And when they come, we will be ready." He did not tell her what he suspected, that the men in the forest were not ordinary bounty hunters, that someone with money and power was willing to spend a great deal of resources to retrieve one escaped nun. But he would find out soon enough. And when he did, Silas Hawthorne would remind the world why he had once been considered one of the most dangerous men in the Rocky Mountains. Silas paused in his storytelling, reaching for his cold cup of tea. The evening had deepened around them, stars beginning to emerge above the distant peaks. Thomas leaned forward, his young face eager in the lamplight. "What happened next, grandfather? Did the men attack?" Silas took a long sip of his tea, his eyes distant. "They did. But that is a story for the next part of this tale. What matters now, what I want you to understand before you leave tomorrow, is what I learned in those first days with your great-grandmother. What was that trust is not given, it is built, slowly, carefully, like a cabin meant to survive winter storms. You do not trust someone because they say pretty words or make grand promises. You trust them because of what they do when the world is trying to tear you apart." He looked at his grandson with eyes that had seen nearly a century of life. "Catherine did not trust me at first. She had every reason not to. Every man she had ever known had either used her, abandoned her, or tried to own her. I was just another stranger, another potential threat. How did you earn her trust? By not demanding it. By giving her space to be afraid, to be suspicious, to keep that knife under her pillow until she was ready to put it away. By showing her through actions and not words that I meant what I said." Silas set down his cup and leaned back in his chair. "Tomorrow you go out into a world full of people who will promise you everything and deliver nothing. You will meet liars and cheats and cowards who smile while they stab you in the back. But you will also meet people like your great-grandmother. People who have been broken by life but refuse to stay down. People who are worth fighting for." He placed his weathered hand on Thomas's shoulder. "When you find those people, do not let them go. Stand beside them. Protect them. Earn their trust the way I earned Catherine's, one honest action at a time." Thomas nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his grandfather's words settling into his bones. "I will remember, grandfather." "Good. Now shall I tell you what happened when Whitmore's men finally came for her?" Thomas glanced at the darkening sky, then back at his grandfather. "Tell me everything." Silas smiled, the expression softening the hard lines of his ancient face. "Then settle in, boy, because the story is about to get much more dangerous." The old man's voice dropped lower as he continued, taking on the cadence of someone recounting events that still live vividly in memory despite the passage of half a century. On the 7th morning after Catherine arrived, Silas began. They stopped hiding. Thomas pulled his jacket tighter, leaning in to catch every word. 3 men rode up to my gate just after sunrise. The leader was a man named Victor Crane, a bounty hunter I had heard of but never met. In those days, his reputation stretched from Kansas to California. They said he had never failed to bring in a target, dead or alive, and that he preferred dead because corpses did not try to escape. What did he look like? Silas closed his eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of old hatred, like death wearing a man's face. About 45 years old, with scars covering his cheeks and jaw. From fights he had won and fights that had cost him dearly. His eyes were the color of gunmetal and just as cold. He moved like a snake, all smooth economy, never wasting emotion. And he wore 2 Colt revolvers on his hips like they were extensions of his own hands. Victor Crane sat atop a black horse at the gate of the cabin, flanked by 2 men who looked like they had been born in saloons and raised on violence. One was thick and bearded, the other lean and twitchy, both armed with rifles and the casual menace of men who had killed before and would kill again without hesitation. Silas stood on the porch of his cabin, the Sharp's rifle cradled in his arms as if he had just returned from hunting. He had not slept the night before, knowing this moment was coming, preparing himself for whatever form it might take. Silas Hawthorne. Victor called out, his voice carrying easily across the snow. I hear you have been living alone up here for 8 years. Funny time to start taking in guests. Silas did not move. His face betrayed nothing. I have no guests, just me and the mountains, same as always. Victor smiled, and there was no warmth in it whatsoever. Then you will not mind if we take a look around. We are searching for a woman. Tall, strong as a man, dark hair. Might be wearing what is left of a nun's habit. You seen anyone like that, Victor's eyes moved slowly across the property, taking in details that a less observant man might have missed. The smoke rising from the chimney was thicker than what one person would produce. There were 2 sets of tracks in the snow near the woodpile, one large and one larger still. And hanging near the door, clearly visible, were 2 coats of distinctly different sizes. Interesting, Victor said, his smile never wavering. You seem to have sprouted an extra shadow, Hawthorne. Silas shifted his grip on the rifle, a subtle movement that told Victor everything he needed to know about how this conversation might end if it went the wrong direction. What do you want? Crane. Victor reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. He held it up so Silas could see the printed words and the rough sketch of a woman's face. Catherine Shaw. Escaped from St. Agnes Convent 6 months ago. Wanted for theft of $300 in convent funds and assault on Reverend Josiah Whitmore, a respected man of God. The bounty is $200 payable upon delivery. Silas looked at the paper without expression. Never heard of her. The Reverend is willing to increase the bounty for quick results. $300, Hawthorne. That is more money than most men see in 5 years of honest work. All you have to do is tell me where she is. And if I do not know where she is, Victor's smile finally faded. Then I suppose I will have to find out for myself, one way or another. He gestured to his men, and they began to move their horses forward toward the gate. Silas raised the Sharp's rifle. The click of the hammer being pulled back was very loud in the cold morning air. This is my property, he said calmly. You are not welcome on it. Turn around and leave, or I will put a bullet through the first man who crosses that gate. Victor stopped. His men stopped. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Victor laughed, a sound like gravel being crushed. Silas Hawthorne, I know who you are too. 20 years ago, they said you were one of the best hunters and trappers in the territory. They said you could track a ghost through a blizzard and shoot the wings off a fly at 200 yards. But that was 20 years ago. You have been hiding up here getting soft while the world moved on without you. He leaned forward in his saddle. I am giving you one chance, old man. Hand her over, take your share of the bounty, and we all walk away happy. Or keep playing hero, and I will burn this cabin to the ground with both of you inside it. Silas did not flinch. Ride away, Crane. This is the only warning you will get. Victor held his gaze for another long moment. Then he turned his horse and gestured to his men. 3 days, he called back over his shoulder. I will be back in 3 days with more men and more guns. If she is still here, what happens next will be on your head. The 3 riders disappeared into the tree line, leaving nothing but hoofprints in the snow and the echo of Victor's threat hanging in the frozen air. Catherine had been hiding in the root cellar beneath the cabin, listening through the floorboards to every word of the exchange. When Silas opened the trap door and told her it was safe to come out, she climbed up with a face as pale as the snow outside. Whitmore sent a bounty hunter after me. A professional. Victor Crane, Silas confirmed. He is as bad as they come. I have to leave, tonight. I cannot let you die because of me. Silas shook his head. If you go out there, Crane will catch you within a day. He is a professional tracker with fresh horses. You would not stand a chance. Then what do we do? Silas walked to the window and looked out at the forest where the bounty hunters had disappeared. We prepare, and I go into town. Town why? Because there is a man there who owes me his life, and it is time to collect on that debt. The next morning, Silas saddled his horse and prepared to make the journey to Silver Ridge. Before he left, he spent an hour teaching Catherine things she would need to know if trouble came while he was away. How to load and fire the Winchester rifle he kept as a backup. The locations of defensible positions inside and outside the cabin. The path to a hidden cave half a mile behind the property where she could hide if things went badly wrong. You are strong, he told her, checking the action of the Winchester one more time. Stronger than any man I have ever met. But strength alone will not stop a bullet. If they come before I return, do not try to be a hero. Use the rifle to slow them down, then run for the cave. I will find you when I get back." Catherine took the rifle from his hands, feeling its weight imbalance. "And if you do not come back, I will come back." "How do you know?" Silas paused at the door, looking back at her. In the gray morning light, she looked less like a giant and more like a woman, young and afraid, and trying desperately not to show it. "Because I made that mistake once," before he said quietly, "leaving people behind when they needed me. I will not make it again." He mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. But Catherine stood in the doorway watching until he disappeared into the forest, and her hand rested on the rifle like a prayer. Silver Ridge was a small town clinging to the lower slopes of the mountains, home to about 300 souls who made their living from mining timber and the various services that miners and loggers required. It had one main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and the small office of the only lawyer within 50 miles. Henry Blackwood was a man of 50 years with graying hair and spectacles that he was constantly pushing up his nose. He had come west from Boston 20 years ago with dreams of gold and had ended up practicing law instead after realizing that miners were easier to fleece with contracts than with pickaxes. But he was not a bad man. Silas knew this because 5 years ago, Henry had gotten lost in the mountains during a hunting trip and had stumbled directly into the territory of a grizzly bear with cubs. Silas had happened upon the scene just as the bear was about to charge. One shot from a Sharps rifle had ended the threat, and Henry Blackwood had been telling anyone who would listen ever since that Silas Hawthorne had saved his life. Now it was time for Henry to return the favor. Silas Hawthorne. Henry said, his eyebrows rising toward his receding hairline. 8 years without coming down from that mountain, and now here you are in my office. What brings you to civilization? "I need legal documents," Silas said, closing the door behind him. "For a woman who is staying with me." Henry's eyebrows climbed even higher. A woman. Silas placed a piece of paper on the desk. Written on it in careful letters was the name Catherine Shaw. "She is being hunted by a bounty hunter named Victor Crane on charges brought by a man named Josiah Whitmore, theft and assault. But the charges are false." Henry picked up the paper and studied it. "Tell me everything," Silas told him. "The convent, the 14 years of abuse, Whitmore's attempt to purchase Catherine like livestock, her escape, her inheritance money, her act of self-defense." By the time he finished, Henry's expression had shifted from curious to grim. "I have heard rumors about St. Agnes Convent," Henry said slowly, "and about Whitmore. There have been whispers for years that something corrupt was happening there. Girls go in and never come out. Money changes hands in ways that do not appear in any official ledger." "Can you help her?" Henry drummed his fingers on the desk, thinking. "If we can prove that the money she took was her legal inheritance, the theft charge falls apart. And if Whitmore was attempting to force her, then her actions were self-defense, not assault. But proving these things will take time. I need to send letters, gather documents, find witnesses. How much time? Weeks, maybe months." Silas shook his head. "We do not have months. Victor Crane is coming back in 2 days with reinforcements." Henry removed his spectacles and polished them, a nervous habit. "There might be another way. If I can get the sheriff involved, if I can show him enough evidence to make him question the legitimacy of Whitmore's bounty, he might be willing to protect her until we can get this sorted out properly." "Do it, whatever it takes." Henry nodded and stood. "I will start immediately, but Silas, you should know something. A man came through town yesterday asking questions about you, about your cabin, your habits, whether you ever have visitors. I think Victor Crane has been preparing for this longer than you realize." Silas felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "Thank you, Henry. I will be in touch." He turned to leave, but Henry's voice stopped him at the door. "Silas, this woman, she must be something special to bring you down from that mountain after all these years." Silas did not turn around. "She is," he said simply, and then he was gone. Outside the lawyer's office, Silas discovered that his suspicions were correct. Victor Crane was standing at the corner of the main street, leaning against the post with the casual ease of a man who had all the time in the world. His 2 men were nowhere to be seen, but Silas had no doubt they were nearby, watching from windows or rooftops. "Visiting the lawyer," Crane called out. For someone who does not exist, Silas kept walking, heading toward where his horse was tied. Victor fell into step beside him close enough to talk, but not close enough to trigger a confrontation in the middle of town. I know she is at your cabin, Hawthorne. I know you are hiding her. And I know why. Do you? Victor smiled that cold reptilian smile. You think she is innocent. You think those charges are false. Maybe you are even right. But it does not matter. The man paying me does not care about justice. He cares about getting what he paid for. And what did he pay for? Victor stopped walking, forcing Silas to stop as well. You really want to know, Whitmore paid good money to that convent to acquire himself a strong woman for his household. A woman who would not break easily, who could work hard and keep her mouth shut. When she ran, she embarrassed him, made him look weak. He does not want her back because he cares about the money or even the assault. He wants her back because she defied him, and men like Whitmore cannot tolerate defiance. Then he is going to be disappointed. Victor's smile faded. You are making a mistake, Hawthorne. I do not want to kill you. You are a legend in these parts, and killing legends is bad for business. But if you force my hand, I will do what I have to do, and then I will take the woman anyway. Silas finally met Victor's eyes. Go back to Whitmore. Tell him she is not property to be bought and sold. Tell him that if he wants her, he can come get her himself. And tell him that if he does, I will be waiting. He mounted his horse and rode out of town without looking back. But he could feel Victor's gaze on him the entire way, cold and calculating, already planning the violence to come. The attack came on the 9th night. The moon was hidden behind clouds and a light snow had begun to fall, muffling sounds and reducing visibility to almost nothing. Perfect conditions for an assault. Silas had expected them to wait the full 3 days. That was his first mistake. Victor Crane had not become the most feared bounty hunter in the territory by being predictable. The first sign of trouble was the horses. Silas's 2 horses in the stable began to whinny nervously, stamping their hooves and pulling at their ropes. Animals could sense danger that humans missed. Silas had learned to trust their instincts. He was already reaching for his rifle when he heard the creak of a floorboard at the back of the cabin. Someone was trying to come through the root cellar. Catherine, Silas hissed. Back door. Now. She moved without hesitation, grabbing the Winchester and positioning herself behind the heavy wooden table that Silas had placed as a barricade earlier that day. Silas aimed his sharps at the back door and waited. The door burst inward, and in the split second before the first attacker could raise his weapon, Silas fired. The roar of the sharps was deafening in the confined space. The man who had been Hank caught the bullet in his shoulder and went down screaming, his rifle clattering to the floor. Before Silas could reload, the front door exploded inward. Rufus came through, firing his bullets, punching holes in the log walls, sending splinters flying. Catherine returned fire with the Winchester, and though her aim was not precise, the sheer volume of lead she was putting in the air drove Rufus back toward the doorway. One of her bullets caught him in the thigh, and he fell with a curse, crawling toward cover. 2 down. But where was Victor? Silas got his answer a moment later when he heard the soft click of a pistol's pocket directly behind Catherine. Victor Crane had come through a window while they were focused on the doors. He stood in the shadows of the kitchen area, one of his Colts pointed directly at the back of Catherine's head. Put down the rifle, Victor said calmly. Both of you now. Catherine froze. Silas felt his heart stop. It is over, Hawthorne. I told you I always get my target. The only question now is whether you both die here or whether you let me take her and live to see another sunrise. Silas calculated angles and distances, but it was hopeless. Victor was too far away for him to reach before the bounty hunter pulled the trigger, and there was no way to get a shot off with the sharps in time. If he tried anything, Catherine would die. Slowly, he lowered his rifle to the floor. Smart man, Victor said. Now kick it away and step back. You too, freak. Put down the Winchester nice and easy. Catherine did not move. Her back was to Victor, so the bounty hunter could not see her face. But Silas could, and what he saw there was not fear, it was fury. 14 years of rage compressed into a single moment. I said, put it down, Victor repeated, pressing the barrel of his pistol against the back of Catherine's skull. Catherine turned around. She moved faster than Silas had ever seen a human being move. The Winchester came up and around like a club, knocking Victor's pistol to the side just as he fired. The bullet went wide, burying itself in the wall, and then Catherine was on him. She grabbed Victor by the throat with one hand and lifted him off the ground. The bounty hunter was not a small man. He weighed at least 180 pounds and was all lean muscle and violent experience. Catherine held him in the air as if he weighed nothing at all. Victor struggled, clawing at her hand, trying to bring his other pistol around to shoot her. Catherine caught his wrist and squeezed. The sound of bones breaking was very loud in the sudden silence. Victor screamed. "I am not prey anymore," Catherine said, her voice low and cold. "I am not property. I am not a freak to be bought and sold." She looked directly into his terrified eyes. "Go back to Whitmore. Tell him what you saw here tonight. Tell him that if he sends anyone else, I will do the same to them. And tell him that if he comes himself, I will not be so gentle." She threw Victor through the open doorway. He landed in the snow and scrambled to his feet, cradling his broken wrist, his face white with pain and shock and something that might have been fear. "This is not over," he gasped. "Yes, it is," Silas said, stepping into the doorway with his sharps trained on the bounty hunter's chest. "Take your men and go. If I see you near this mountain again, I will not aim for shoulders and legs." Victor backed away, helped his wounded men onto their horses, and disappeared into the night. Silas and Catherine stood in the doorway of the damaged cabin, watching the tracks in the snow until they were certain the bounty hunters were truly gone. Then Catherine began to shake. All the rage, all the strength, all the fierce determination that had carried her through that fight drained away, leaving only the exhaustion of someone who had been running and fighting for too long. Silas caught her as her knees buckled. He held her while she trembled, not speaking, just letting her know through his presence that she was safe. "They will come back," Catherine whispered. "Victor said it is not over, I know. Whitmore will send more men, enough men to overwhelm us." "Probably. Then why are you still standing with me?" Silas was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the bloodstains and the tracks, and the evidence of violence with a clean, white blanket. Because he finally said, "For 8 years I have been waiting to die. I told myself I deserved nothing but solitude and suffering. But then you came, Catherine. You came out of the storm like something from a fever dream, broken and bloody and proud. And for the first time in 8 years, I found something worth living for." Catherine looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "I do not know what is going to happen tomorrow," Silas continued. "I do not know if we will survive what Whitmore sends next. But I know this, I would rather die standing beside you than live another day alone." The fire had burned down to embers. Outside, the wind whispered through the damaged walls. And in that moment, in the ruins of a battle, they had somehow survived. Two people who had thought themselves beyond hope found something neither had expected: each other. The next morning, a rider came from town. It was not Victor Crane or any of his men. It was a boy of about 14, his face red from cold, and his horse lathered from hard riding. Silas recognized him as Tommy Blackwood, Henry's son. "Mr. Hawthorne." Tommy gasped, sliding off his horse. "My father sent me. It is urgent." "What happened?" "Reverend Whitmore arrived in Silver Ridge yesterday afternoon. He has 12 of the men with him, all armed. They are staying at the hotel, and my father heard them talking about coming here tomorrow morning." Catherine, who had come to stand beside Silas, felt her blood turn to ice. 12 men. "But there is more," Tommy continued. "My father found something. Letters between Whitmore and the Mother Superior at St. Agnes Convent. They have been doing this for years, Mr. Hawthorne, taking girls from the convent and selling them to wealthy men. Miss Shaw is not the first." Silas felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. Those letters. Can they prove Catherine is innocent? "My father thinks so. If we can get them before a judge, not only will Miss Shaw be cleared of all charges, but Whitmore will face trial for human trafficking and fraud." "That is a big if. Whitmore has 12 armed men. He is not going to let himself be arrested." Tommy nodded grimly. "My father knows that. He is doing something about it. But he needs time. He said to tell you to hold out until tomorrow afternoon. He will bring help." "What kind of help?" Tommy was already climbing back onto his horse. "The kind that carries badges," he said. "And guns." After the boy had ridden away, Silas and Catherine stood in the yard of the cabin looking at each other. 24 hours, Catherine said. 24 hours against 12 men. Silas walked back into the cabin and began pulling supplies from storage. Ammunition, food, medical supplies, everything they would need for a siege. "We have advantages, they do not," he said. I know this mountain better than anyone alive. I know every path, every hiding spot, every choke point. And I have had 20 years to learn how to make unwelcome visitors regret coming here. You think we can win? Silas paused a box of rifle cartridges in his hands. I think we can survive long enough for help to arrive. And sometimes surviving is the same thing as winning. They worked through the day preparing for the battle to come. Silas set traps on all the approaches to the cabin. Tripwires connected to bells that would alert them to anyone's approach. Pits covered with thin branches and snow that would catch an unwary man or horse. A network of concealed positions where a defender could fire and then relocate before the enemy could return fire. He showed Catherine the cave he had mentioned before, the one half a mile behind the cabin. Inside, he had stored enough supplies to survive for a week. If things went badly wrong, that was where she would go. I am not running, Catherine said flatly. You are not running. You are surviving. There is a difference. I will not leave you to face them alone. Silas turned to face her. If they take this cabin, if they overwhelm our defenses, then staying here means capture or death for both of us. But if you escape to the cave, you can wait for Henry's help to arrive. You can testify against Whitmore. You can make sure that what he did to you, what he did to all those other girls, does not go unpunished. And what about you? Silas smiled, a rare expression on his weathered face. I have been waiting 8 years for a good reason to die. If it comes to that, holding them off so you can escape seems like as good a reason as any. Catherine grabbed his arm. That is not funny. It is not meant to be. But it is the truth. You have your whole life ahead of you, Catherine. A life of freedom, of choices, of possibilities you have never been allowed to imagine. I am not going to let anyone take that away from you. Not Whitmore, not Victor Crane, not anyone. They stood there in the cold afternoon light, the mountain rising behind them and the threat of violence looming before them. And something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of what they had become to each other, what they might still become if they survived what was coming. That night they sat together by the fire for what might be the last time. There is something I need to tell you, Silas said, his voice quiet in the flickering light. Something I have never told anyone. Catherine waited, her dark eyes watching him with an intensity that made words difficult. I told you I came to this mountain because I felt I deserved to be alone. That was true, but I did not tell you why. He stared into the flames, seeing not fire but memories. In 1866, I had a wife named Martha and a daughter named Sarah. She was 6 years old with her mother's eyes and my stubborn chin. They were everything to me, Catherine. Everything. What happened? Silas was quiet for a long moment. I was a hunter, a trapper. I took contracts to bring in furs and meat for the settlements in the territory. That winter, I got an offer I could not refuse. A 3-week expedition to Wyoming, payment enough to buy more land to give my family a better life. His hands clenched in his lap. I left them in Millbrook, a small town 20 miles from here. I told Martha I would be back before Christmas. I told Sarah I would bring her a present from the mountains. And I rode away. Catherine could hear the pain in his voice, old and deep and never fully healed. 3 weeks turned into 5 when a blizzard trapped us in the high country. By the time I made it back to Millbrook, the town had changed. People looked at me with pity. Some would not look at me at all. The fire crackled between them. A fever had swept through while I was gone. Scarlet fever. It took dozens of lives in less than a month. Martha died on the 3rd day. Sarah held on for almost a week. They were buried together in the cemetery outside town. His voice broke slightly. I never got to say goodbye. I never got to hold their hands while they passed. I never got to tell them how much I loved them one last time. They died alone, wondering where I was, wondering why I had not come to save them. Silas. I came to this mountain because I could not bear to be around people anymore. Every face reminded me of what I had lost. Every happy family was a knife in my heart. I told myself I was doing penance, that I deserved to suffer, that if I had just been there, somehow I could have saved them. Catherine moved closer to him, close enough that her shoulder touched his. You could not have known. I know that now. I knew it then. But knowing something and believing it are two different things. He turned to look at her, and she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. Vulnerability, hope, and something that looked almost like love. You asked me why I am willing to risk everything for you, Why I am standing beside you when I could just turn you over and go back to my safe, empty life. Yes, it is because you reminded me what it feels like to care about someone again, to have something worth protecting, to have a reason to wake up in the morning that is not just habit and survival. He reached out and took her hand. Her hand was large and calloused and strong enough to crush his fingers if she chose. But she held his grip as gently as if she were cradling something precious and fragile. I do not know what tomorrow will bring, Silas said. I do not know if we will live or die. But I know this, whatever happens, I am glad you came to my door that night. I am glad I opened the gate. I am glad I got to know you, Catherine Shaw. Catherine felt tears prickle at her eyes, an unfamiliar sensation after years of forcing herself not to cry, no matter what was done to her. I am glad too, she whispered. They sat together in the firelight, two damaged souls who had somehow found each other in the wilderness. Outside, the night was cold and dark and full of danger. But inside that small cabin, surrounded by preparations for war, there was warmth. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was the beginning of love. Shortly after midnight, they heard the first sounds of approaching horses. Whitmore had not waited until morning. Either Victor Crane had convinced him that delay was dangerous, or the Reverend was simply too impatient to wait any longer for what he considered his property. Catherine Silas said sharply, "Positions." They moved through the cabin with the efficiency of people who had rehearsed for this moment. Silas took his place at the front window with the Sharp's rifle. Catherine positioned herself at the side window with the Winchester. They had barricaded the back door and root cellar entrance, making the cabin defensible from two directions only. Through the darkness, they could see lanterns moving through the trees. Silas counted them. 6, 7, 8. At least 8 men in the first wave, probably more hanging back in reserve. The odds were not good. Hawthorne, a voice called from the darkness. It was not Victor Crane. This voice was older, smoother, with the oily quality of a man used to getting what he wanted through money and manipulation rather than direct action. Josiah Whitmore. I know you can hear me. I know the woman is in there with you. This does not have to be difficult. Silas said nothing. I am a reasonable man, Whitmore continued. I do not want bloodshed. All I want is what belongs to me. Send the woman out, and I will let you live. You have my word as a man of God. Catherine's grip tightened on the Winchester. Her voice was barely a whisper. He will never let you live. You know that. I know. Then why are we waiting? Silas sighted down the barrel of the Sharps, finding Whitmore's silhouette in the darkness. The Reverend was standing behind a tree, using it as cover, but a good portion of his body was still visible. Because I want him to know who is about to ruin his life. He raised his voice, projecting it through the broken window. Whitmore, I know what you have been doing at St. Agnes. The buying and selling of women,
Thomas, this
the
land
fraud,
holds our story.
the corruption.
I will,
Henry
Grandfather.
Blackwood
I promise.
has your letters.
Good. Now go on.
By tomorrow, every lawman in the territory will know what you are. Silence from the darkness. Then Whitmore's voice came again, and the smoothness was gone. In its place was something cold and vicious. Blackwood is a fool, and you are a dead man, Hawthorne. Take them. The night exploded into violence. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as Whitmore's men opened fire on the cabin. Bullets punched through the log walls, sending splinters flying. Glass shattered. Wood cracked and groaned. Silas returned fire, the roar of the Sharps drowning out everything else. His first shot caught one of the attackers in the chest, dropping him instantly. He reloaded with practiced speed, fired again. Missed, reloaded. Catherine fired the Winchester as fast as she could work the lever, not aiming carefully but laying down a volume of fire that kept the attackers from advancing. Her bullets chewed into tree trunks and kicked up snow, forcing Whitmore's men to stay in cover. The first wave faltered, then pulled back. How many did we get? Catherine asked, breathing hard. 1 dead for certain, maybe 2 wounded. That leaves at least 10. I know. They reloaded in the brief lull, hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. Outside, they could hear Whitmore shouting orders, his voice high and angry. The second wave came from 2 directions at once. This time, the attackers were smarter. They used the darkness and the terrain to advance in short rushes, one group firing while the other moved. Silas and Catherine could not cover both approaches at once. Fall back, Silas ordered. Interior positions. They retreated to the center of the cabin, using the heavy furniture they had arranged earlier as cover. The attackers reached the cabin walls and began trying to break through the barricaded doors. A window shattered and a man tried to climb through. Catherine met him with the stock of the Winchester, driving it into his face with all her considerable strength. He fell back, screaming, his nose destroyed. Another man came through a different window. Silas shot him with his pistol, then shot the one behind him. But there were too many. They could not cover every entrance. Catherine, Silas shouted, "The cave. Now, I am not leaving. You have to. I will hold them off." No. She grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the back of the cabin. "We go together or not at all. I did not survive 14 years of hell just to run away the first time someone stands beside me." There was no time to argue. The front door was giving way, and more men were coming through the windows. "Together then," Silas said. "The cave." They ran out the back door that Silas had left unbarricaded for exactly this purpose, across the moonlit snow toward the tree line. Behind them, the cabin filled with Whitmore's men, and angry shouts followed them into the darkness. "There she is! Get them!" Gunshots cracked through the night. Silas felt a bullet tug at his coat. Catherine grabbed his hand and pulled him faster, her long legs eating up the distance. They plunged into the forest. Silas knew these woods like he knew his own heartbeat. Even in the darkness, even with pursuers behind them, he led them through the trees without hesitation. Behind them, their pursuers were not so lucky. The traps Silas had set during the day began to take their toll. A tripwire sent one man crashing to the ground. A concealed pit swallowed another. The sounds of pursuit grew more distant, more confused. Almost there, Silas gasped. Just a little further. The cave entrance was hidden behind a fall of rock, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Silas found it by touch and memory, guiding Catherine inside just as the first of their pursuers emerged from the trees 50 yards behind them. Inside, they pressed against the cold stone walls, trying to control their breathing. The cave went back 30 feet and curved, blocking them from view of the entrance. Outside, they heard men cursing and searching their lanterns, creating dancing shadows at the cave mouth. But no one thought to look behind the rocks. No one knew the cave existed. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, the searchers gave up and retreated toward the cabin. Silas and Catherine stayed where they were, not daring to move until dawn began to lighten the sky. "We made it," Catherine whispered. "For now. What do we do next?" "We wait," Silas said. "Henry promised help by afternoon. We just have to survive until then." Catherine leaned against him, exhaustion finally catching up with her. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not letting me go alone." Silas put his arm around her shoulders. "I told you. Together or not at all." They sat in the darkness of the cave, waiting for either salvation or destruction, and neither knew which would arrive first. The old man paused in his storytelling, his voice growing hoarse from the long recitation. Thomas sat motionless, completely absorbed in the tale. The night had deepened around them, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out its haunting song. What happened next? Grandfather did help arrive in time. Silas reached for his cold tea and took a long sip. It did, but not before one final confrontation that changed everything. That is a story for the last part of this tale, though. He looked at his grandson with ancient, knowing eyes. The lesson from this part of the story, Thomas, is this: when you find someone worth standing beside you, stand beside them, no matter the cost. Catherine and I did not know if we would survive that night. We did not know if help would come, but we knew that we would face whatever came together. Is that what you meant when you said trust is built, not given? Yes. By the time that night was over, Catherine and I had saved each other's lives more than once. We had seen each other at our worst and at our strongest. We had faced death together and survived. That is how trust is built, grandson, through fire and blood and sacrifice. Thomas nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of his grandfather's words. There is more, is there not? More to the story, much more. The best part, really. The part where two broken people learned that they deserve to be happy again. Silas smiled, and in that smile, Thomas glimpsed the young man his grandfather had once been, strong and brave and capable of love. But that will wait for the final telling. Go stretch your legs, get us some fresh tea, and then I will finish the story. Thomas rose and headed for the kitchen, his mind full of images of moonlit battles and desperate escapes, and two people holding hands in the darkness of a cave. Behind him, Silas stared at the distant mountains, lost in memories of a woman who had come to him out of a blizzard and changed his life forever. The morning light crept slowly into the cave, painting the rough stone walls in shades of gray and gold. Silas had not slept. He had spent the night watching the entrance, listening for any sound of approaching danger, his pistol ready in his hand. Catherine had dozed fitfully against his shoulder, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion, even as her mind fought against rest. Now she stirred, blinking in the pale light, and for a moment Silas saw confusion in her eyes as she remembered where they were and why. How long, she asked, her voice rough from sleep. A few hours until noon. Help should come by afternoon if Henry keeps his word. And if he does not, Silas did not answer. They both knew what would happen if help did not arrive. Whitmore had the cabin. He had men and guns and patience. All he had to do was wait them out or search the mountain until he found their hiding place. Catherine sat up, stretching muscles stiff from sleeping on cold stone. In the dim light of the cave, she looked younger, somehow more vulnerable. The fierce warrior who had thrown Victor Crane through a doorway seemed very far away. Silas, she said quietly, if this is the end, there is something I want you to know. It is not the end. But if it is, she turned to face him fully, her dark eyes holding his. I want you to know that these past days with you have been the happiest of my life. 14 years in that convent, and I forgot what it felt like to be treated like a human being. You gave that back to me. Silas reached out and took her hand. Then let me give you more than a few days. Let me give you a lifetime. Catherine's breath caught. What are you saying? I am saying that when this is over, when Whitmore is dealt with, and you are free, I want you to stay. Not as a guest, not as someone seeking shelter, but as my partner, my equal, my wife, if you will have me. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Catherine stared at him, and Silas saw tears forming in her eyes, tears she had trained herself never to shed. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you are strong and brave and good. I know you have survived things that would have broken anyone else. I know that when you laugh, which is not often enough, it sounds like music. And I know that for the first time in 8 years, I have a reason to wake up in the morning. Catherine wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that was somehow both fierce and tender. You are a foolish old man, she said. Is that a yes? It is a yes. If we survive this, it is a yes. Silas pulled her close and held her, feeling her heart beat against his chest. Outside, the mountain waited indifferent to human drama. But in that small cave, something precious had been born. A promise of tomorrow. Around midday, they heard the sound of many horses approaching. Silas tensed, reaching for his rifle, but Catherine put her hand on his arm. Listen, she said. He listened. The hoofbeats were coming from the wrong direction, not from the cabin where Whitmore's men were camped, but from further down the mountain, from the direction of town. Carefully, Silas crept to the cave entrance and peered out through a gap in the rocks. What he saw made his heart leap. A column of riders was making its way up the mountain trail. At the front rode Sheriff Marcus Cole, his tin star glinting in the winter sunlight. Beside him was Henry Blackwood, and behind them came at least 15 men, miners and loggers and farmers from Silver Ridge, armed with rifles and the grim determination of people who had decided that enough was enough. Henry kept his word. Silas breathed. Catherine appeared beside him, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. All those people, they came for us, they came for justice. There is a difference, but today it amounts to the same thing. They emerged from the cave and made their way down the slope to meet the column. Sheriff Cole spotted them first and raised his hand to halt the riders. Hawthorne, Miss Shaw, you are both alive, barely, Silas replied. Whitmore has the cabin. At least 10 men, maybe more. The sheriff nodded grimly. We know. We have been watching them since dawn. They think they are the hunters, but they are about to find out they are the prey. He turned to address the assembled riders. Men of Silver Ridge, you all know why we are here. Henry Blackwood has shown me letters that prove Josiah Whitmore has been trafficking women from St. Agnes Convent for years, buying them like cattle and selling them to the highest bidder. Catherine Shaw is not a criminal. She is a victim who had the courage to fight back. Murmurs of anger rippled through the crowd. The sheriff continued, Today we are going to arrest Whitmore and his men. If they resist, we will use whatever force is necessary. I do not want any of you taking unnecessary risks, but I also do not want any of those bastards escaping to hurt someone else's daughter or sister or wife. He drew his pistol and checked the cylinder. Let us ride. The battle for the cabin was shorter than Silas had expected. Whitmore had positioned his men around the property, expecting a siege from two fugitives, not an assault from a small army of angry townspeople. When 15 riders appeared on the ridge above the cabin, the Reverend's hired guns took one look at the odds and began to recalculate their loyalty. Josiah Whitmore, Sheriff Cole, bellowed his voice carrying across the snowy clearing. You are under arrest for human trafficking, fraud, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Order your men to throw down their weapons and surrender peacefully. For a long moment, nothing happened. Silas could see Whitmore standing on the porch of his cabin, the cabin that Silas had built with his own hands, and even from a distance he could read the fury and disbelief on the man's face. This is outrageous, Whitmore shouted back. I am a man of God. I have done nothing wrong. That woman is a thief and an escaped criminal. Henry Blackwood rode forward, holding a sheaf of papers above his head. I have your letters, Whitmore. Letters to the Mother Superior at St. Agnes. Letters discussing prices and preferences and delivery arrangements. You wrote about Catherine Shaw specifically. You wrote that you wanted a woman who was strong enough to handle hard work and too broken to fight back. He paused, letting his words sink in. You were wrong about that last part. Whitmore's face went from red to white. His men were looking at each other now, muttering, some of them already lowering their weapons. They had signed on to chase down an escaped nun, not to fight a war against a whole town for a boss who might be headed to prison. One by one, Whitmore's hired guns threw down their rifles and raised their hands. Victor Crane was among them. His wrist was still splinted from Catherine's grip, and he met Silas's eyes with something that might have been respect. You win this round, Hawthorne, he said quietly. But I always get my target eventually. Not this time, Silas replied. Not ever again. Finally, only Whitmore remained defiant. He stood on the porch of the cabin, his face twisted with rage, a pistol in his hand. She is mine, he screamed. I paid for her. I have a contract. Sheriff Cole dismounted and walked slowly toward the porch, his own pistol drawn, but pointed at the ground. There are no contracts for human beings, Reverend. This is America, not a slave market. Put down the weapon. You do not understand. She defied me. No one defies me. I am a servant of God. You are a servant of your own greed and lust. Now put down the weapon before someone gets hurt. Whitmore's eyes darted around the clearing, looking for escape, for allies, for anything that might save him from the ruin closing in on all sides. He found nothing. His gaze landed on Catherine, standing beside Silas near the tree line. You, he hissed. You ruined everything. You were supposed to be grateful. You were supposed to be obedient. You were supposed to be mine. Catherine stepped forward, her head held high, her shoulders back. I was never going to be yours, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the snow. I am not property. I am not a possession. I am a human being, and I would rather die free than live as anyone's slave. Whitmore raised his pistol, aiming directly at Catherine. Several things happened at once. Silas shouted a warning and started to raise his rifle. The sheriff lunged forward, trying to reach Whitmore before he could fire. The men of Silver Ridge lifted their weapons, ready to cut down the Reverend if he pulled the trigger. But it was Catherine who moved fastest. She did not run away. She did not take cover. She strode directly toward Whitmore, her long legs eating up the distance between them, her dark eyes locked on his with an intensity that made the armed men around her hesitate. Go ahead, she said, still walking forward. Shoot me. Prove to everyone here what you really are. Not a man of God, but a coward who would rather kill a woman than face justice for his crimes. Whitmore's hand trembled. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. Stay back, he warned. Stay back, or I will shoot. Catherine kept walking. You have taken everything from women like me for years. Our freedom, our dignity, our hope. But you could never take our souls. You could never make us truly yours, no matter how hard you tried. She stopped 10 feet from the porch, close enough that he could not miss. So go ahead. Pull the trigger. But know this, even if you kill me today, you have already lost. The world knows what you are now, and that knowledge will follow you to your grave. The silence stretched out taut as a wire. Then Whitmore's face crumpled. The pistol fell from his hand, clattering on the wooden planks of the porch. He sank to his knees, and what came out of him was not a prayer, but the sound of a man whose carefully constructed world had just collapsed around him. Sheriff Cole stepped onto the porch and put the Reverend in irons. Josiah Whitmore, you are under arrest. You will be transported to Denver for trial. May God have mercy on your soul, because I doubt the judge will. As the sheriff's men led Whitmore away, Catherine stood in the snow and watched. Silas came to stand beside her, and without thinking about it, she reached out and took his hand. It is over, he said quietly. Is it? The hard part is, the rest is just paperwork and waiting. Catherine turned to face him, and there were tears on her cheeks, but she was smiling. You asked me something this morning, in the cave, I remember. I want to give you a proper answer now. Not because we might die, but because we are going to live. She squeezed his hand. Yes, Silas Hawthorne, I will be your wife. The wedding took place 2 weeks later, when the worst of the winter weather had passed and travel was possible again. It was not a grand affair. Catherine had no family to invite, and Silas had spent too many years as a hermit to have maintained friendships. But the people of Silver Ridge came anyway, drawn by the story that had spread like wildfire through the territory. The story of the mountain man who had sheltered a fugitive nun. The story of the giant woman who had stood up to a corrupt preacher. The story of two people who had found each other in the wilderness and refused to let the world tear them apart. Henry Blackwood served as witness. Tommy Blackwood carried the ring's simple bands of gold that Silas had purchased in town with money he had saved over 8 years of solitary living. Sheriff Cole stood at the back of the small crowd, keeping a watchful eye for any trouble, though none came. They held the ceremony in a clearing in the forest behind the cabin, beneath a massive pine tree that had stood on that spot for perhaps 200 years. Silas had chosen the location deliberately. This was the place where he had come for 8 years to grieve for Martha and Sarah, the place where he had made his peace with loss and loneliness. Now it would become something new, a place of beginnings instead of endings. Catherine wore a simple blue dress that the women of Silver Ridge had sewn for her as a wedding gift. It was the color of a summer ski, and against her dark hair and darker eyes, it made her look almost otherworldly. Not the broken refugee who had stumbled through a blizzard, but a woman transformed by hope. Silas wore his best clothes, which were not very impressive by city standards, but were clean and well-mended.
Thomas, this land holds our
His beard was trimmed, his hair combed, and in his
promise.
weathered face,
Good.
Catherine
Now go
saw
on.
something she had never expected to find joy. Since there was no preacher willing to perform the ceremony on short notice, and since Catherine had complicated feelings about men of the cloth anyway, they spoke their vows to each other, with Henry Blackwood serving as the official witness for the legal documents. Silas went first, his voice steady, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. I have spent 8 years believing I did not deserve happiness. I thought my heart had died with my wife and daughter, and I was content to let it stay dead. But you, Catherine, you brought me back to life. You showed me that it is not too late to find love, to build a home, to have a family. I promise to stand beside you through whatever storms come our way. I promise to protect you, to respect you, to cherish you for as long as I have breath in my body. I promise to be the man you deserve, even when I do not feel worthy of you. You are my second chance, and I will not waste it. Catherine had to wipe her eyes before she could speak her own vows. For 14 years, I was told I was worthless, a freak, a monster, something to be used and discarded. I believed them, Silas. I believed I did not deserve kindness or love or a home of my own. Then you opened your gate on the worst night of my life, and you showed me what true goodness looks like. You never asked anything of me. You never demanded I earn your protection. You simply gave it freely and completely. I promise to spend the rest of my life being worthy of that gift. I promise to stand beside you in every battle. I promise to give you a home filled with warmth and laughter and love. You saw me when no one else would, and I will never forget that. I choose you, Silas Hawthorne. Today and every day for the rest of our lives. They exchanged rings, simple circles of gold that meant more than any diamonds could have. And when Silas kissed his bride, the small crowd erupted in cheers and applause that echoed off the mountain peaks. Catherine Hawthorne. It had a nice ring to it. Spring came early that year. The snow melted faster than anyone expected, revealing green shoots pushing up through the dark earth. The air grew warm, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers and new growth. The mountain that had seemed so harsh and forbidding in winter transformed into something gentler, something almost welcoming. Silas and Catherine settled into married life with surprising ease. She was not the kind of woman to sit idle while her husband worked, so they divided the labor of running the homestead between them. Silas handled the hunting and trapping. Catherine managed the vegetable garden that she had started behind the cabin and took over the heavy lifting that had once been necessary for Silas to do alone. They talked, not constantly, for neither of them was the chattering type, but enough. They shared stories of their pasts, the good memories and the bad ones. They made plans for the future. They learned each other's habits and quirks and the thousand small things that make up a life lived together. And they laughed, not often, for laughter did not come easily to either of them. But when it did, when something tickled their shared sense of humor, the sound of it filled the cabin like music. 3 months after the wedding, on a morning bright with summer sunshine, Catherine woke feeling strange. She lay in bed for a long moment, trying to identify what was different. Her body felt the same as always, strong and capable. But there was something else. A flutter in her stomach that was not quite nausea. A tenderness in her breast that she had never noticed before. She said nothing to Silas that morning. She needed to be sure. A week later, she was sure. Silas was in the barn mending a harness when Catherine appeared in the doorway. The light behind her turned her dark hair into a halo, and there was something in her face that made him put down his tools and give her his full attention. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Catherine stepped forward and took his hand. Without speaking, she placed it on her stomach, pressing his calloused palm against the fabric of her dress. "Nothing is wrong," she said quietly. "Everything is exactly right." It took Silas a moment to understand. When he did, the look on his face made Catherine laugh out loud, a sound of pure joy that startled both of them. "You mean, yes, we are going to, yes, a baby, yes, Silas, a baby, our baby." Silas stared at her, then at his hand on her stomach, then back at her face. And then he did something that Catherine had never seen him do. He wept. Not dramatically, not with sobs or wails, just tears sliding silently down his weathered cheeks, catching in his gray beard, dropping onto the dusty floor of the barn. "I thought," he said, his voice breaking. "I thought I would never have this again. I thought that part of my life was over." Catherine pulled him close, wrapping her strong arms around him, holding him while he shook with emotions too long suppressed. "It is not over," she whispered. "It is just beginning." They stood like that for a long time, two people who had both lost everything, holding on to each other, and the promise growing between them. The months that followed were the happiest of Silas Hawthorne's life. He had forgotten what it felt like to anticipate the future with joy instead of dread. He had forgotten the pleasure of working towards something beyond mere survival. Now every task he undertook had new meaning. Every improvement to the cabin was for the child who would live there. Every animal he hunted was food for his growing family. Catherine bloomed in pregnancy. Her already formidable strength seemed to increase, as if her body knew it was growing something precious and was marshaling all its resources to protect it. She continued working alongside Silas well into her 8th month, ignoring his protests that she should rest more. "I have spent 14 years doing hard labor," she told him. "Growing a baby is easier than hauling stones." But the night the child decided to arrive, she was glad to have him beside her. It happened in the depths of winter, almost exactly a year after Catherine had first appeared at Silas's gate. Of fitting symmetry, they would later agree. The snow was falling heavily, though not with the violence of that first blizzard, and the wind sang mournfully through the pines. Catherine's labor was hard and long. Silas had brought in a midwife from Silver Ridge, a practical woman named Mrs. Henderson, who had delivered half the babies in the territory over the past 30 years. She took charge of the bedroom, while Silas paced in the main room, feeling more helpless than he had during any of the gunfights or ambushes he had survived. He could hear Catherine through the door. Not screaming, she was highly proud for that, but grunting with effort and occasionally letting out low groans of pain that made him want to break something. The hours crawled by. Dawn came and went. The morning aged toward noon. And then finally a new sound filled the cabin. The cry of a newborn baby. Silas burst through the door before Mrs. Henderson could tell him it was safe to enter. He found Catherine lying in their bed, exhausted, in sweat-soaked, and more beautiful than he had ever seen her. And in her arms, wrapped in a clean cloth, was a tiny red-faced creature with a shock of dark hair and a voice that could probably be heard in Silver Ridge. "A boy," Catherine said, her voice hoarse but triumphant. "We have a son." Silas approached the bed on legs that did not feel entirely steady. He looked down at the baby, at the impossibly small fingers, and the scrunched up face and the eyes that were squeezed shut against the brightness of the world. His son, his and Catherine's son. He is perfect, Silas whispered. He is loud, Catherine corrected, but she was smiling. He gets that from you, I think. I have never made that much noise in my life. Give it time. Parenthood changes people. Mrs. Henderson, bustling efficiently around the room, paused to pat Silas on the shoulder. You have a healthy boy and a healthy wife, Mr. Hawthorne. Not everyone is so blessed. What will you name him? Silas looked at Catherine, and a silent question passed between them. They had discussed names during the pregnancy, but had never settled on one. Jacob, Catherine said softly. Jacob Hawthorne. Silas nodded, feeling the rightness of it. Jacob it is. And in that moment, holding his wife's hand while their newborn son filled the cabin with his cries, Silas Hawthorne finally understood that his years of penance were over. He had been given a second chance at life, at love, at family. And this time he would not waste a single moment of it. The old man fell silent, and Thomas realized that tears were streaming down his own face. The night had grown very late. Stars blazed overhead in patterns that had looked down on the Hawthorne family for generations. The mountains stood sentinel in the darkness, eternal and unchanging. Jacob, Thomas said softly, that was my great-grandfather, your son. My firstborn, Silas confirmed. The first of many blessings that your great-grandmother gave me during our years together. How long were you married? 44 years. Catherine passed in 1918 during the influenza epidemic. She was 73 years old, and she was still the strongest person I had ever known. Silas's voice was steady, but Thomas could see the grief that still lived behind those ancient eyes. I held her hand when she went. I was there this time. I told her I loved her, and she told me she would be waiting for me on the other side. She said death did not scare her because she had already faced worse things and survived. He smiled, a sad but peaceful expression. She was not afraid. That was Catherine. Never afraid, not of poverty, not of violence, not of the opinions of small-minded people, and in the end, not of death either. Thomas wiped his eyes. I wish I could have known her. You do know her grandson. Every time you stand up for what is right, even when it is hard. Every time you refuse to back down from a bully. Every time you treat someone with kindness when the world tells you they do not deserve it. That is Catherine's legacy living on in you. Silas reached out and placed his weathered hand on Thomas's shoulder. Tomorrow you go out into the world. You will face challenges I cannot imagine, dangers I cannot protect you from. But you will not face them alone. You carry the blood of people who survived everything life could throw at them and came out stronger. You are a Hawthorne, and Hawthorns do not break. I will try to make you proud, grandfather. You already have, boy. You already have. They sat in silence for a long moment, the old man and the young one, bound by blood and story and the weight of history. Then Silas spoke again, his voice soft but firm. One last thing before you go. The most important thing. Yes, grandfather. When you find someone worth loving, do not wait. Do not hesitate. Do not let fear or doubt or the expectations of others keep you from reaching for happiness. I wasted 8 years hiding on that mountain, convinced I did not deserve joy. Catherine showed me how wrong I was. He leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. Life is short, Thomas, shorter than you think. The people we love can be taken from us in an instant, without warning, without a chance to say goodbye. So say the things that need saying. Do the things that need doing. Love with your whole heart and do not hold back. I will remember, grandfather. I promise. Good. Silas leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 93 years. Now help an old man up to bed. This storytelling business is exhausting work. Thomas stood and offered his arm. Silas gripped it with surprising strength and pulled himself to his feet. Together they walked into the house that 3 generations of Hawthorns had called home. Behind them the Rocky Mountains stood silent and eternal, keeping watch over the valley where a mountain man had once opened his gate to a stranger and changed both their lives forever. The next morning, Thomas Hawthorne boarded a train heading east. He carried a small bag of belongings, a heart full of his grandfather's stories, and a determination to live up to the legacy of the people who had come before him. Silas stood on the platform and watched until the train disappeared around a bend in the tracks. Then he turned and walked slowly back to his wagon, feeling the weight of his years, but also feeling something else: pride. His grandson would face dangers and challenges that Silas could not imagine. The world was changing, had changed so much since that winter of 1874, when a giant woman had appeared at his gate in a blizzard. But some things remained constant: courage, honor, the willingness to stand up for those who could not stand up for themselves. Thomas had those things. Silas had seen them in the boy's eyes as he listened to the story of Catherine Shaw, the nun they left for dead, who had risen to become the matriarch of a family. Catherine would have been proud too. Silas climbed into his wagon and started the long drive home, his mind filled with memories of a woman with dark eyes and impossible strength, of winter nights by the fire and summer days in the garden, of a son's first cry and a wife's last breath. It had been a good life, he reflected, a life worth living, a story worth telling. And now that story had been passed on, as all stories must be, to the next generation. The rest was up to Thomas. Silas Hawthorne died peacefully in his sleep on a spring night in 1925, 1 year after sharing his story with his grandson. He was found the next morning by his housekeeper, a peaceful expression on his weathered face, one hand resting on the pillow beside him, as if reaching for someone who was no longer there, or perhaps for someone who had finally come to take him home. Thomas received the news by telegram while stationed at a training camp in Virginia. He requested and received emergency leave to attend the funeral, arriving just in time to see his grandfather laid to rest beside his great-grandmother in the small cemetery behind the Hawthorne homestead. The headstone read simply, Silas Hawthorne, 1831 to 1925. Beloved husband, father and grandfather, he opened the gate. Thomas stood at the grave for a long time after the other mourners had departed, remembering the old man's voice and the story that voice had told. Then he straightened his shoulders, put on his cap, and walked back toward the house. There was a war coming, everyone said so, and young men like Thomas would be called upon to fight it. But he was not afraid. He was a Hawthorne, and Hawthorns did not break. Behind him the wind rustled through the pine trees, and if he had listened very carefully, he might have heard something that sounded almost like laughter, two voices intertwined, a man's low chuckle and a woman's bright joy. Together again at last. In the end, every life is a story. Some stories are grand adventures full of heroism and sacrifice. Others are quiet tales of ordinary people doing ordinary things. But every story matters because every story touches other stories, creating ripples that spread outward through time and in ways we can never fully understand. The story of Silas and Catherine Hawthorne touched many lives. Their son Jacob grew up to become a respected rancher and community leader. His children spread out across the country carrying the Hawthorne name and the Hawthorne values with them wherever they went. Thomas himself served with distinction in the Great War and returned home to marry and raise a family of his own. He told his children and grandchildren the story his grandfather had told him, passing down the legacy of a mountain man and a runaway nun who had found each other in a blizzard and built something beautiful from the wreckage of their lives. And sometimes on winter nights when the snow fell heavily and the wind sang through the pines, those children would swear they could see two figures walking hand in hand through the storm. A tall man with a gray beard and a taller woman with dark hair. Both of them smiling, both of them finally at peace. Because love, true love, does not end with death. It simply changes form. And the best stories, the ones that really matter, they never truly end at all. They just keep being told generation after generation, a gift from those who came before to those who will come after. This has been the story of Silas Hawthorne and Catherine Shaw. May their memory be a blessing. And may all who hear their tale find the courage to open their own gates when strangers come knocking in the storm.